Welcome to the Irish NFL Show in association with QuinnBet. It's day 2 in the big free agent house after a busy Monday. Things a little bit calmer today, but we did see some big business being done and some more intriguing moves around the league, including a homecoming for Geno Smith. He's right back where he started at the New York Jets. Isaiah Pacheco teaming up with Jahmyr Gibbs in the dynamic backfield in Detroit. Romeo Doubs exiting Green Bay and heading to New England. And the Houston Texans finally adding some much-needed beef to their offensive line. They've had a couple of departures in this offseason, of course, so they add Braden Smith. And they've made Kaimi Fairbairn, incidentally, the highest-paid kicker in the league, signing him to a $13 million contract extension. So selfishly, from the point of view of the Irish Kickers Club, of whom we are proud members, nice to see that market being reset, and fingers crossed for you, Charlie Smith, when that time comes for you, that you'll be getting Fairbairn-like money and they'll throw the bag at you wherever you might be, whether it's in New Orleans or elsewhere. We'll get through all those deals and a lot more tonight. But first, Kieran O'Donovan, let's start off with Geno Smith. We saw the Sam Darnold redemption arc, another quarterback who was nearly broken by the New York Jets experience. We haven't seen a guy go back there, though. Geno Smith, who famously said, "They wrote me off, I ain't right back," as one of his former teammates said, "They wrote back, Geno, they wrote back."
And I was only looking up the history with Geno Smith with the Jets today, and didn't one of his teammates break his nose before he left as well? Broke his jaw. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, he goes back to the Jets. Whether that's whether that's a happy turn of events for him or not, it remains to be seen. The Jets' woes are well documented, not least on this show by Kieran in particular. I mean, he's a poet and a scholar when it comes to citing the Jets' history of absolute failure and spectacular failure.
Is he a poet and a scholar, or just an inveterate troll of the Jets? At least he does it in a poetic and scholarly way.
He phrases it well.
Just as well he's not around tonight, anyway.
In terms of the Jets, is it a good move or a bad move? It's a riskless move because they get him at barely above the league minimum. They get a veteran who did go to Seattle and have that that second wind in his career. I mean, he was a front runner for or one of maybe an outside bet for MVP just a couple of seasons ago,
and paved the way for them winning the Super Bowl.
For them winning the Super Bowl, absolutely, yeah. And got Pete Carroll fired 2 years in a row, or whatever you want to call it. But I mean, you could hardly put the Raiders' woes down to Geno Smith alone last year. I mean, he had one of the worst offensive lines in the league, and he showed the year before that he clearly had franchise quarterback potential. What this tells me is that the Jets are probably gearing up to not spend too much money on a quarterback this year, and then look maybe the following year and see what's in the draft the following year. Because again, I cite Kieran. Kieran is probably better qualified than me, and maybe you guys are as well.
Isn't it interesting though, in that context, the point you're making, that the Jets traded for him? They didn't wait for him to be released because they knew there'd be competition. Like, that tells you everything about how teams are viewing the quarterback market and viewing the draft, right? So Kyler Murray, veteran minimum, yes please. Tua Tagovailoa, yes please. Geno Smith, don't want to risk him hitting free agency per se because he'll be snapped up by someone else. The Vikings had expressed interest, and there's jobs for these guys because there just aren't enough guys to go around.
Well, in a world where we're speaking about Malik Willis, like he's the Patrick Mahomes the second, Patrick Mahomes is already Patrick Mahomes the second, isn't he? So the third, the fourth, I don't know, but yeah, I think we've been probably overhyping some of the quarterbacks in this free agency market for that reason alone. And as I said, Geno Smith is, I mean, he's not a huge risk. And when you're looking at what the Raiders need to do, they need to build out again top to bottom. So they need to spend money elsewhere, pick up players elsewhere, get a serviceable quarterback at the very least this season. And what I'm hearing is that this isn't a very strong quarterback draft. I think there's a bit of talk about potentially the fact that they might take is it Ty Smith, or they might go in for Ty Smith, but more likely that they'll wait. Or Ty Simpson, excuse me, but more likely that they'll hold off for a quarterback next season. And for me, I mean, when it comes to the Jets, why not? Remains to be seen how it will unfold.
Like, one of the things I always find as we progress at lightning speed through free agency, Brian, is once the GMs all gather around and get in their little sewing circle at the combine, and I think they just play two truths and a lie, right? Because you can't lie to everyone all the time about what you're doing, or people just stop listening to you, right? But they put out a little bit of smoke screen to try and misdirect people, but they also they have some real, true exchanges, and they're open and honest about what they're intending to do. And everybody goes away from the combine they're not there to look at the guys working out. They're there to swap gossip and to decide who's doing what, to figure out in their own minds whether they are going to realistically be able to get what they need in the draft, or whether they need to address the needs in free agency. And then you get a better sense of the totality of the picture, right? So I think what we've seen, as myself and Kieran were just talking about there, is where people view the quarterback market, who's actually positioning themselves for 2027, and who needs a bridge to get through 2026 to hopefully be able to get the guy that they actually want in the draft. So crazy money for Daniel Jones, because, well, who else are you going to get to replace Daniel Jones? As Kieran was saying, Malik Willis, Jeff Hafley knows him as well as anyone, in fairness, so he knows what he's got there in Malik Willis, and maybe he'll prove that turns out to be a gem. But it's just telling you everything I think you need to know about how that 2027 draft class is viewed, that they're outside of Mendoza and maybe Ty Simpson. Nobody's getting too excited about the signal callers coming out this year.
No, absolutely not. Sure. Even suggesting as Ty Simpson may not even go in the first round. There is one speculation, depending on what nature of which podcast you're listening, or whatever mock draft, there's a scenario where he gets picked late in the first round, but by all accounts, people suggest he'll go in the second round. And even with that, the Jets, by all accounts, if they are the team that are in for him, are slightly nervous by the fact of, will someone jump them? Geno may be that kind of security blanket. I just don't think it's going to go down well in Jets, with Jets fan base who are already disgruntled after another difficult season, whether the head coach should remain with the GM. There's other options. Kirk Cousins is going to get released tomorrow. I'm not necessarily saying he's the better option, but maybe that would have been something that they could have. He said, I just think bringing Geno back kind of brings back the haunted ghost of previous years with him there. But you're right, kind of, you've nailed it there. They would have all kind of got together at the combine. And even speaking to Pat Leonard, who was on the show at the Super Bowl, he said the reason the beat writers go to the combine, it's not because they want to sit there watching the guys on the field. It's because those 2-day window where they have an opportunity to quiz the GMs, quiz the head coaches, do their work and go home. That's ultimately what they're down there for.
I mean,
that's
obviously we all watch it that bit more closely from our own team's perspective, and we try and leave that at the door when we come on the show. But let's be realistic. We all spend a little bit more time kind of anoracking around what our own teams are going to do. But I thought it was fascinating from the Max Crosby perspective, right? You going through the combine, the Bears were talked about as being one of the front runners to do the Max Crosby deal. It's clear that whatever Ryan Poles heard at that combine, he said, no, price is too rich. They traded DJ Moore, who might have been used as a bargaining chip, as we were saying the other day, in a potential deal if they were going to do it. And they clearly moved on. Tyler Linderbaum is another one that the Bears were linked very closely to. And it was clear that whatever indications came out of the combine, again, Poles thought, that's too expensive. And they traded for Garrett Bradbury and got their deal done with the Patriots at center instead. So you see who wasn't in the Max Crosby stakes, and the Bears and other teams who went into the combine at the top of that list disappeared very quickly, because people obviously had wind of what the Cowboys were preparing and maybe had some sense of how rich the Ravens were prepared to make the pot, and then they went and started doing their deals elsewhere. As soon as the first moves start, you see who knows what coming out of the combine. Yeah,
and I'll give you another example there. The Giants were highly suggested as a team. They're going to make a serious run at Kenneth Walker, MVP from the Super Bowl. Conor, he signs with the Chiefs within 15 minutes of the 4 p.m. window he has to the Irish time for $15 million a year, 45 over 3 years. I'm sure there's all these other bonus structures in there. But immediately it struck me as there's no way any team we're realistically going to go in at that kind of price. And we are going to come to, because obviously Chiefs running back is signed for the Lions this afternoon. But the Chiefs have made a real defensive decision here. We need to get our running game back in flux here, because that complements Patrick Mahomes. Mahomes was doing a lot of. You look at Mahomes' rushing yards last year. I think it was his highest in his career, because he was scrambling, because he had no run game essentially for large parts of the season. And I get there was injuries involved.
And Mahomes rushing means Mahomes under threat, and we saw the consequence of that.
Yeah, exactly. Now they brought in what they will say is a bona fide running back that can put the team back on an even keel. But the money, let's be fair, for only 2 or 3 years there, when we were talking about Derrick Henry money, Saquon Barkley money, and all the hoopla that came out of that when the Giants decided not to go down that route. But $15 million a year for running back in a game where they're getting banged up, and we're seeing running backs getting selected in the 5th and 6th rounds and have contributions immediately, I think it's very rich. But yeah, it's very much your point. That deal was probably struck 2 weeks ago.
And as you were saying, the player going the other way, the Chiefs releasing Isaiah Pacheco to the Lions, who will want him to replace Montgomery, who has gone to the Texans. So that's an I'm going to say it here and speak it into existence, right? We had Sonic and Knuckles with Gibbs and Montgomery in the backfield. Pacheco, who is known as one of the more aggressive and violent runners in the league, it's now Sonic and Brass Knuckles. You heard it here first.
If it's Brass Knuckles, if he comes back to the Pacheco that me and you experienced at the Super Bowl firsthand in Vegas a couple of years ago when he had, like, he was, if you recall that playoff run, I think they played the Dolphins, that coldest game in a long time, and where Tua couldn't even feel his hands, and he was like lightning bolt in that game. But he had a really stellar playoff run there, and he played really well in the Super Bowl. But he has been consistently injured over the course of the last 2 years, Conor. So I think you touched on it earlier. Which one are we going to see? Are we going to see the guy that can go in there and bring back the form of a couple of years ago, or the guy that kind of continues to get banged up? He's probably playing at a level now, and in terms of how he goes about his game, that leads to more injuries. So maybe he needs to be a little bit smarter, but maybe he can be a compliment to Gibbs, who really is a really efficient running back, and he's going to get paid. And I think obviously inevitably David Montgomery was the odd man out because he knew to kind of, it was time to freshen him up there.
Kieran, the Packers have had a really busy free agency and a lot of players going out the door. In fact, they only made their first signing of the window, and we'll get to that a little later in the cornerback, Benjamin St-Juste. But Romeo Doubs is one of the people exiting. You called it that, they were bound to let somebody go out of that wide receiver room. It's Doubs is the guy. He goes to the Patriots, where he'll be a much needed outlet, I'm sure, from Drake May's perspective. But he's a loss in Green Bay. Like, he's a guy who stepped up in big moments. I mean, I'm delighted to see the back of him, to be honest with you, because he nearly always turned it on against the Bears. Costly mistake on special teams notwithstanding in one of those games last season. He was a very reliable target for Jordan Love, particularly stepped it up in the playoffs. He's got some great highlight moments in Green Bay.
Yeah, in an offense that was known for not really choosing or identifying a true number one, that it was a constant kind of a revolving door of good, decent number twos in Reed and Watson and Wicks and Dobbs. It was Dobbs that was the consistent presence on the field, and obviously that showed that reflected the trust that Matt LaFleur had in him in big moments. Notwithstanding, possibly the biggest moment of the year was the one that he failed to field the onside kick. That was a costly moment for the Packers. But Dobbs is I think he's a good pickup for New England. I will miss him as well as a Packers fan. I think in some of the bigger moments when he needed to show up.
Isn't it interesting, by the way, the two of the players exiting Green Bay are players that fumbled the ball against the Bears, in Malik Willis and Romeo Doubs?
Yeah, maybe that's their punishment.
You're done.
Yeah, absolutely. No, like Dobbs, it hasn't been plain sailing for Dobbs in Green Bay. There's been some moments like the one I've just mentioned. There's been a few injuries as well, and there's been some kind of I suppose questionable fragility on the part of Romeo Doubs. Things that weren't exactly outwardly documented, and that's a testament to Matt LaFleur in keeping things in house. But he did have to manage Romeo Doubs off the field a few times, and not in. There was no suggestion that he was troublesome in any way or anything like that. But having said that, I do think he was one of the Packers' more trusted receivers in the last few years. I mean, last season he had 724 yards, 6 touchdowns, and 55 receptions. And I said that he didn't break the 1,000 yard mark, but that's not what the Packers were about in letting any one receiver dominate the carries. And when you look at it from a Patriots perspective, in letting Stephon Diggs out the door, they needed an upgrade, or they needed a replacement in the wide receiver room. Is he going to be their true number one? I don't think so. I'd still wonder whether the Patriots will try and make a move for another receiver. I mean, he's in there now with Booty, Hollins, Demario Douglas. You're still wondering. I mean, Dobbs he's shown flashes of ability to take the top off a defense, but it was actually in the latter stage of his time at the Packers when he started to run more intermediate routes, when he was running more kind of outside routes, these curl routes. He was picking up really, really important short yardage kind of receptions for the Packers. So they may yet do more business in terms of their wide receiver room, but I do think it's a really good pickup for New England. And we'll be missed in Green Bay.
What do you make overall of the moves that they've made? Because it has been busy with a lot of exits and Rashawn Gary and Quay Walker, and there are reasons for those exits too. But those were both solid contributors, high draft picks, guys who flashed, real elite talent at times in Green Bay in what was a very high performing defense. I know bringing Micah Parsons in kind of changes the picture, and you've got a new defensive coordinator now in Jonathan Gannon. Very highly rated from his time in Philadelphia. And I think probably quite a clever move, kind of like the 49ers going with Robert Saleh last season. You get a guy off a head coaching stint and people almost forget how good he was as a coordinator to get there in the first place. But it does seem like the Packers are literally shuffling the pack, if you pardon the pun. There's clearly a plan here.
Yeah, I hope there's a plan. I don't know if there's clearly a plan, but I hope there is, because you're losing, you mentioned some players, so you're losing Quay Walker and Kingsley Enagbare, two, I think, really underrated contributors in that.
I think Barry was a phenomenal run stopper, and again, I would you have focused on those Bears game where you're up against one of the best rushing attacks in the league, and Barry just showed up all over the place when the Packers needed him to.
So you bring in Zaire Franklin, and you I suppose you hope that this that he's going to fill some of that, I suppose, fill some of that void. You're not going to have Micah Parsons fully fit coming into the start of the season, so there's an instant massive vacuum there in terms of pass rushing ability. Rashawn Gary has been, I think it's fair to say, has been a disappointment. He hasn't lived up to the hype. Really good locker room guy, really good person, and person to have in the locker room. His production just hasn't been to the level of what was expected of him. You have the other Lucas Van Ness is still in the building, and again another guy who has yet to step up in that regard. So there's still a void in terms of getting that pass rush to where it needs to be. This time last year they brought in Nate Hobbs, and we were talking about whether that was the right or wrong move. He's out the door already, and he was on a 4-year deal. That's a huge bust. You bring in this cornerback today, Senju. So I've been looking up. Again, not a flashy signing, but from what I'm reading and from what I'm watching, a very good coverage guy. He's got the length and he's got the physical attributes to be a good guy in coverage. Don't let your mind slip to the gutter again, Conor.
it never leaves the gutter, this.
But what I suppose the glaring reality is that the Packers still have work to do in their secondary. They still have work to do in their pass rush. So that kind of that secondary, all the way up to the D line has to be, it has to be upgraded. Whether they're going to try and do that in the draft, or whether they have more splashes to make, whether they'll try and get themselves in the market for the likes of a Trey Hendrickson, I don't know. But as you said, you say there's clearly a plan. I don't see that plan yet, but I certainly hope there is one.
Brian, the Texans' O-line is something that we have to talk about. They let Juice Scruggs go. They revamped or attempted to revamp the offensive line, which was one of the worst in football the season before last. Wasn't necessarily any great shakes the season just gone either. And CJ Stroud needs more help there. The Texans have finally done something that might make his life a little bit easier in signing Braden Smith from the Colts, their right tackle, who's a highly rated and one of the better O-linemen available in free agency.
Yeah, and comes across from the divisional rival in the Colts. I remember you did that interview with Sean Pendergast in Radio Row, and he was talking about the offensive line struggles and how CJ Stroud is not developing. And they're not entirely sure if he's not developing because he's just not at the level in which people thought after the first year, or because of the unfortunate situation around the offensive line, and it just hasn't been rebuilt and put in a position to allow him to flourish. And it just seems like there's a lot of people going out on the offensive line. Even last year when they made the trade with the Commanders, moving their biggest player off the offensive line, they just haven't really retooled properly. There was a few brought in from the draft last year. I think the draft this year again, like the one thing I would say is, and Kieran Boyle would be here to say this, there's a lot of good offensive line available. I'd be interested to see what they do if they do consider going down this route, because
well that again, it's a really good point, because as we were talking about the quarterbacks earlier, the indication that you get from this and from some of the guys who weren't snapped up in free agency, the O-linemen who are available, is that a lot of teams who are counting on filling gaps on their offensive line seem to be pretty confident they're going to be able to do it in the draft. So they must be pretty high on the crop of players that are available.
Yeah, and there's a number of offensive line goes with a lot of injury concerns. Like Tucker's got to deal with the Patriots. He's from the Jets there late last night or just during the night here, and the Giants were heavily involved in that. But I think the longevity of the contract that he was looking for was a bit off-putting for a number of teams because of the nature of his injuries, and which has had. There's a few others, including a few from Baltimore, that haven't been picked up yet because they've got continuous injury concerns. And I think you're looking at that, you're looking, okay, there's a upside and a downside. We saw Campbell with the Patriots had a good season, but ultimately in the playoffs, you could see he was starting to have the struggle of a long season. And Kieran Boyle always alludes to that with rookies as well. Conor, that long season longevity that they just don't have in the college game, so Conor can come back to haunt you, and they did in the playoffs. So maybe look maybe it's a mixed bag for the Texans. Maybe what they'll do in the draft, and it's still reasonably early. We're in the free agency. We haven't hit the third wave yet. Maybe to bring in more players. So it was nice to see something come in, because I was looking at it last night going, he's gone, and yet the Texans haven't done anything. So that was an interesting one. Getting a player within the division, so I guess he will know the Texans reasonably well. Might be a little bit of a comfort, but I think there's still a lot to be done there.